So you guys all know Conan, right? Conan, he has an interesting ethical quote from Dartmouth. 64 students are being accused of cheating in an ethics course. They've been given an honorary doctorate in irony. So, again, you know, I'm kind of tiptoeing around the how difficult ethics can be, right? And this is kind of one of the things I want to leave you with is that if you have a simple answer, you're probably not thinking. I mean, there should be a little bit of anxiety in your ethical decision if it's a tough ethical decision. And this is one of the hard things to get across to an American audience who's grown up with the humanist secular philosophy of anxiety is bad, happiness and pleasure are good. Nothing wrong with that, but remember that anxiety is kind of like yeast in the bread. You know, a little bit of anxiety, a little bit of nervousness when you're up here is good. It's when it starts to take control of you that it's bad, right? And especially if you don't recognize it. So, irony is good. The idea to hold opposing ideas in your head in the same time is what F. Scott Fitzgerald said was the mark of intelligence. Right? It's when you've locked onto something, when you transferred your responsibility for ethics to something or someone or some other ism, that you can get into trouble. The example I use is a man named Jason Blair. This is what got me started with ethics. I told you about the statistic of 40% of the college students teaching. So I looked at probably the best example of an outstanding, idealistic individual. It was Jason Blair. He was a student at an African American student who got hired by the New York Times and won the Pulitzer Prize for his journalism, and was writing one story after the next about experiences of African Americans in the United States, and winning award after award. And all of a sudden, something happened. I'll let you read the history of him. He still gives lectures on ethics around the country, and he just started making stuff up. And what he found was that nobody caught him. It's Jason Blair, right? It's Walter Cronkite giving the news, or so he could write whatever he wanted, and he started making stuff up. He started becoming a novelist as a journalist, and he got caught. And when they did some research into it, he was discredited and still is as a journalist. So now, as I said, he travels around the country giving ethics lectures to students like yourself. That's what he does. And when I saw what he said and how he did, I started that at Cal Poly. And but what his bottom line was is once you realize you're not going to get caught, you need to come back into something internal. It has to be something internal, and we all call that the conscience. But it has to be internally generated, right? So so he was saying, how do you get around to where you impose this self-discipline and it becomes something internalized? And I got caught onto that as well. So I came on to the ethics of history. We started presenting the ethics of history, and it was caught up. People heard the talk, and I started giving the talk in conferences. And then they invited us, the National Academy invited us as Cal Poly as one of the 25 best programs in engineering for ethics. This was all relative to engineering at the time. We were designated as an exemplary education activity and program. So this was published about the year I retired, in 2014. It was published by the National Academy of Sciences, and it was considered, again, an exemplary program. And then there's reasons why it was exemplary, and it's basically because what was happening, we tried to establish a common ground by presenting the history, and I'll give you a quick example of that in a few minutes, how we presented that. But as you can read from the top left, the primary goal of the effort was to complement and enhance exposure to and information about engineering ethics with philosophical hearing in a way that generated lasting internal student concern about ethical behavior in a manner that facilitates what traditionally has been called developing a conscience. Because in the past, what we did was case studies. We give engineering case studies. Well, a student has no experience with case studies. They don't know. So let's just give the history of how ethics evolved in society, and then they can maybe be part of that, and then we can start a discussion, which basically is how can we foster and provide meaning and purpose for all individuals, no matter the talent, motivation, or status, given an increasingly materialist worldview and an individual's shrinking importance within it that is based on an ethical worldview based on reason alone. If you follow science like this, and if you're a rationalist like I like to think I am mostly, you realize that we become an increasingly smaller part of the universe, right? We used to think of the stars as now just a piece of the Milky Way. It's a piece of the Milky Way. Milky Way is a piece of a galaxy. The galaxy is a piece of other galaxies. So where do the human beings go? Science is basically, and psychotherapy, psychiatry is making us an increasingly smaller part of the universe that we realize. So how can we still hang on to ethics in that case? So the internal acceptance of ethical standards implants in oneself what has traditionally been called the conscience, the essence of personal integrity. So this is kind of like thinking that when you're a kid, you think that when I'm 18, I'm not going to do what my mom says anymore. And when you're 70 or 50 years old, you realize that's one of the stupidest things you've ever learned. You're going to do what your mom says as long as you're alive, as long as she's... And my mom is no longer alive, and I still have dreams about she'd be chewing me out for doing this, So I can still give chocolate rabbits to all my grandkids like she used to, because I'm going to get chewed out someday if I don't, right? So how do you internalize that behavior? So I started a presentation. I'll give you a piece of it this hour. It's called Ethics is Myth, Ethics is Conscience. It kind of combines psychiatry, the best available that I could find, and psychotherapy, and neuroscience. So this is always still developing. It's always a developing program of what we're looking for. So if you go outside of this class, you'll see that conscience is also divided up into normative, applied, and meta. And a normative ethics is what we used to teach, or we still teach, as codes of ethics in your particular group. There's a code, everybody accepts that, and then they violate it like crazy. But we all accept that. Those are the moral standards and regulations that everybody agrees to when you start a job. Then there's applied ethics. And applied ethics would be how you've applied that code of ethics. And I give you some examples from my personal life. If you don't have any in your life, I guarantee you, being high levels of society that you're going to be when you graduate and later, you will hit these ethics. And then there's meta-ethics. Meta-ethics are the philosophical origin, the history, the anthropological history of ethics. How did it develop among societies? And how does reason and rationality change that as we got away from the dogma views of religions and the negation of absolutism? And of course, what is the mathematical and scientific analogy? Now, that's what I presented to engineers. I'm going to skip that. We will skip that for this class because it assumes a knowledge of mathematics that would be with the scientific or engineering populace. So here's our code of ethics. I picked one from the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers, of which I'm a member, and everybody, of course, would agree with this code of ethics. The problem is it doesn't work. It isn't. Engineers are still making decisions that are somewhat harmful. So what we're looking for is a necessary and sufficient condition for ethics, knowledge plus conscience. And by the examples, hopefully you understand what I'm talking about now. How can I make this an internal thing, or at least think about it as an internal thing? Implant or renew in the student a lasting, ingrained ethical sense of moral behavior that's equal to the conscience. And focus on the philosophical roots of meta-ethics and mathematical analogy. We're going to skip the mathematical analogies. They're amazing. There's a paper that's on the PolyLearn. You can read it. You can read my paper. It'll give you the mathematical analogies. It's usually a 10-lecture sequence that I gave. But today I'm just going to give you a very short introduction to it. And of course, it's basically based on this guy, who was Baruch Spinoza. Baruch Spinoza was Netherlands, a Jew who was thrown out of the synagogue for his rational beliefs. He is the source of our modern ethics out of the Enlightenment. And what I'm going to do today, what I'm going to do right here, is give you a very quick presentation of how ethics evolved in our societies. Where did it come from? How was it used? Why did society? What was common amongst all societies? And Spinoza, in the Enlightenment, considered all that history and said, okay, based on all this history of ethical development, this is what we should do. And he published a book called Ethics. That book is still in print. You can still get it on Amazon, right? It still contains great stuff. And you'll recognize the ethics of the good and the ethics of the right in it. After Spinoza, it split off into Jeremy Bentham and Immanuel Kant. But this is the first guy that pretty much did it. And he looked at Greek society, Roman society, and it was very interesting. In Roman society, ethics started with a woman. Hypatia lived in Alexandria around the year 400, and Hypatia was the head of the mathematical group at the time of Platonists. She was a Neoplatonist, and she was about 1,000 years ahead of her time. So what happened to Hypatia, being 1,000 years ahead of her time, leading this philosophical group? She was killed, right? She was killed for being a witch because she didn't conform with the existing dogmas, whatever they were, conflicting dogmas at the time. So she was pulled off her chariot and killed, cut into pieces, and burned in the temple. So it says the temple still had priority even in the year 400. So, how did it all start? Well, if you do anthropology at all, you'll see that before the year 1000 BC, before that time, it probably was a very violent time. It wasn't Rousseau's golden savage time or the Garden of Eden. It was very violent. Sacrifice was the issue. We sacrificed to the gods. They gave us some decent things. The human species was basically, all societies everywhere, even the primitive societies today, were based on sacrifice. There wasn't this necessarily idea of eternal life. That idea didn't come. But it was just the idea that I'm going to do this or we're not going to get plants. Won't be food next year unless we kill this young female here or sacrifice this goat, or there won't be food next year. So that society globally tended to fall apart. So what's called the Axial Age by Karl Jaspers, who's a noted philosophical psychoanalyst in Germany, he called it the Axial Age because the world's great religions started all over the world, independently of each other, around the year 1000 BC, 800 BC. So you got Confucianism in China, and you got Zoroastrianism in Persia, which today Iran. Those were the cities that were killed in last year. They were Zoroasters. You had monotheism in Israel, started about this time, Jeremiah. And you had Pythagoras in Greece. And Pythagoras in Greece is the funniest case because the Greeks worshiped number. They didn't worship Zeus. They were much too smart for that was for the common people. But the intellectuals worshiped number. Everything was perfect. Everything was the ratio of whole numbers. And that carried on for a long time. Pythagoras wasn't known for his theorem. That theorem was known well before his time. What he was known for was the golden ratio, the ratio of a rectangle, small side to the big side, two sides to the whole, the ratio of the Pantheon in Greece today. All the Greek buildings were built with the golden ratio. And because it was a perfect ratio of number. Music was the strings. You could pluck the harmonics of the strings. Everything was perfect based on number. Well, Hippasus, a counterpoint, said that no, the golden ratio was not a rational number. It wasn't a rational ratio of numbers. It was irrational. So what did Pythagoras do? He killed him. They killed him because if you didn't believe the dogma, you were going to die. So they killed him. Well, then Hippasus's guys, they killed Pythagoras. So we can see already the start of a religious war based on mathematics in Greece, which is hilarious, right? And the story is even more hilarious than that. I don't have time to go into it. But it's just absolutely hilarious. These guys killing each other. And of course, Hippasus was right. And the name irrational still holds on to those numbers. It still holds on. Well, I said I wasn't going to talk about numbers, but I got carried away, right? Because it's so cool. So after the other religions, of course, some of them positive and eternal life. And if you think that eternal life depends on X, Y, or Z, well, you'll do X, Y, or Z. It doesn't matter if X, Y, or Z are good or X, Y, or Z are horrific, right? So the belief by itself in eternal life was what Axial Age started, and it was fine as long as you were within your helicopter or student group. As long as you're within your group, you're fine. But the groups tended to, as Hippasus and Pythagoras showed, the groups tended to fight. Because if you didn't get the dogma right, you weren't going to be eternally alive. So eternal life was dependent on getting it right. So Hypatia, who came up in the year 400 with a rational system which preceded, it was almost what Spinoza had come up with, but she was killed by a mob of monks in Alexandria as a pagan mystic. So for about 1,000 years after Hypatia, from 400 to 1400, again, we had superheroes. And again, the superheroes ironically tended to be women. So one of the superheroes was Eleanor of Aquitaine, who basically sired all the kings and queens in the Middle Ages, all of them. And her story is amazing. Well, you just get a piece of it. Rent the Lion of Winter, where Katharine Hepburn plays her while she was in jail. The king put her in jail. Her husband put her in jail because she was so powerful. And the other hero, of course, is Joan of Arc. Joan of Arc, who was the first woman to lead an army and win in battle. She wasn't of age. She started when she was 16. She was killed when she was 19. But she was the first woman to lead and win an army. Who was the first to lead an army? Eleanor of Aquitaine. She led one of the armies in the Second Crusade. Wasn't that successful, but so until the Enlightenment, we don't have many heroes. Everybody's following in their own group ethics, except for a couple outliers. Who outliers tend to be women, amazingly. But the religious wars that accompanied the 15th century were so horrible, we can't even mention it. It started with the 100 Years' War in England and France. And England was so bad. I mean, they would disembowel people. They'd bury them alive. The horrific thing that English did while they were in France was horrible. Now, France wasn't France then. It was just a bunch of... Paris was France. That was it. The rest of it was just open countries. So Joan of Arc was, of course, the reaction to that English horror. But after that, that war tended to spread with religious wars, and about a third of the population was killed in Europe. Horrific. Just imagine that today. That'd be 50 million dead in the United States, right? So it's a horrific time. And the ethics are breaking down. The ethics of the religious system are breaking down. So enter Spinoza. His family was thrown out of Spain in 1492. He was called a Sephardic Jew. He was descended from Sephardic Jews. And the interesting thing is that it said that Columbus was delayed in his Lina, Pinta, and Santa Maria. He was delayed because there were so many boats carrying Jews out of Spain that he couldn't get out of the harbor. That's probably a legend. But Spinoza was descended from those people. And he eventually himself got thrown out of the synagogue. He died when he was about 42 years old. But he founded, based on Descartes, who he took seriously. You know, Descartes is, I think, therefore I am. That was also a foundation. But Descartes was a very religious person. Spinoza said he believed in God, but he didn't think that God necessarily gave a hoot about people, right, based on his experience. So his work ethics was at the bottom, was the foundation for a rational morality without any dependence on religious dogma. So he could avoid the religious wars that had decimated it. It didn't end until 1648 with the Peace of Westphalia, which created the modern nations today. Netherlands, Belgium, all those nations were created in 1648 when they decided to end killing each other in horrific ways. So Spinoza's rules for living were very simple: get along with others, enjoy those pleasures that safeguard health, attain enough wealth to maintain a vigorous mind. And you can see the seeds of the philosophy of good in his philosophy. He also carried a signet ring with a rose on it, with thorns, because he said the reasonable individual has to be very careful of how they apply their ethics, because they could be hurting other people. So he had thorns on it to remind himself that ethics was always going to generate some anxiety if you were trying to do it properly. So he's still a great man, died very young, glassmaker, but he is the source of our ethics that is based on reason. So what does psychiatry and neuroscience say about all this history that I just gave you? Well, it looks like they're verifying a lot of it as accurate. Anthropologists are finding that, yeah, there was an actual age. Yeah, it looks like the human species is very violent. Look at the chimpanzees and the other kind of apes. There's all kinds of different kind of monkeys and everything, but there's only one kind of human right? There's only Homo sapiens. There were hundreds of Homo species. Where are they all? Where are Neanderthals? Did they all just naturally die off, or did we help them along? So it's an open question, but the data right now is looking on we are a very violent species. That is our background. That's our genetics. And the first person to really recognize this is Freud. He came up with the concept, which is still valid today. I know a lot of psychologists, last class, they come up to you, we don't listen to Freud anymore. Yes, you do. Everything, all the neuroscience has shown that Freud was right. Not in the Oedipus complex. That's been discounted. But so did Freud discounted that at the end of his life. Freud agreed with his mentors, Jung and Adler and Rank. He agreed with his students at the end of his life that what he proposed wasn't right. But this has always been in there. We are basically the tools of our subconscious, right? What we call the id. And the id was basically grabbed on by one of his students, Carl Jung, who broke with Freud. And Carl Jung did an amazing thing. He showed that the subconscious stories and myths that people believe are common across all cultures. So we all have a Little Red Riding Hood story. We all have an Oedipus-like story, right? It isn't sexual father motherhood. That was kind of associated with Freud. But there is a hero. There is a hero story that all of us, there is a challenge. There is a great challenge. Our meaning for our life finds itself in meeting and overcoming challenges. That's what you're here at Cal Poly, right? You're going to get your degree and you're going to go do great challenges. It's part of our makeup, and that comes from Jung found. It comes from our archetype, great myths that are common across all cultures. Now this has been expanded. The latest research shows that it looked like there was common languages across all cultures, right? The common proto. Well, if you look at a culture like Polynesian, Tahiti, Hawaii, all those widely separated islands, they can prove pretty much conclusively that it came with one language, one myth, one common myth, lots of taboos that were identical across that whole culture. Now that's easy to understand, right? Well, they're kind of boats, they were sailing around a couple hundred years ago and they all discovered each other. Well, go to the Bishop Museum in Hawaii and look at their history. When their culture was destroyed, how was it destroyed? Around 1810, the whalers were going in there and they were secularizing the Hawaiian culture. Well, the Hawaiian upper classes decided they didn't need to do these taboos, like I can't eat with my brother if I'm a princess. So one of the princesses decided to eat at a banquet with her brother, who was going to be the king. That's a no-no. 2 months later, society collapsed. Across the island, the whole society collapsed. So it made a fertile field for the Protestant missionaries who came in around 1835, 1840. They had a fertile field because Hawaiian society had collapsed because they got rid of the taboos, right? The ancient things that were part of their culture. But here's an interesting fact. Would you think that Armenia and Iran and widely separated countries in Indo-European, that they have a common language? They're showing that, yeah, there's a proto-language, there's a common language in Iran and Armenia, just like there is among the islands. So research is showing that Jung had it right. And what Jung gave an example that is really a great example. He said that the source of our archetypes is in our collective subconscious. I not only have my subconscious that I'm got, you have one, and in our culture, it's the same. We learn the same things from our culture through language when we're growing up, which my 5-year-old granddaughter is learning now, well, unfortunately, from my story that I tell her. I don't tell her stories I tell you, but other stories, right? So Jung said it's kind of like having a horse, and our conscious mind is sitting on the horse, and we think we're in control of it. But basically what happens? You go where the horse goes, right? So you make decisions. Do you ever talk to yourself? Everybody talks to himself. I hear my wife talking to herself in the shower. She'll never admit it. But I said, what the hell are you talking to in here? You know? I mean, we live on the second floor. Somebody couldn't come through the window, right? So it's gotta, who are we talking to, right? It's your conscious and your subconscious having this conversation. It's right there for you to recognize. So the idea is to maybe if the horse is going where it wants to, well, we could train the horse, right? So the examples that I've given you are the Polynesian Islands, Tahiti, Fiji, Hawaii. They share the cultural archetypes of myths and taboos. and the proto-languages, common language, as well as the Indo-European cultures. Look, Armenia, Iran is Persian and Romance languages, right? They all share a common source, a common cultural myth. That's why our fairy tales and our stories are so common amongst widely separate cultures. That we owe to Carl Jung. He calls it the archetypes, cultural myths that resides in everyone's, and we're writing those things. Those cultural myths are sitting there, like my mom is still sitting there telling me what to do, right? She's part of my subconscious now, telling me what to do, and I think I control it, but really I'm going to go where she wants me to go, right? I'm going to go where mom and dad want me to go, because that's how I grew up. So that's a major insight from psychoanalysis that helped us understand what some of our problems are. So what we call mind today, is what neuroscience tests, and what do these neuroscience tests show about what Freud and Jung and their other, Alfred Adler is in there. Alfred Adler talked about the wholeness of people in the community, and Otto Rank talked about the fear of death, how the fear of death doesn't exist in our subconscious. Any fear of death that you've got or idea of death is in your conscious mind. Your subconscious, according to Otto Rank, there's no death in your subconscious. So you see how easy it is to latch on to a belief system or ideology that encourages that. If your subconscious doesn't believe in death, right, and there's a philosophy or idealism that's going to go on forever. Communism is going to go on forever. The Third Reich is going to go on for 1,000 years or more. Well, I latch on to that because my subconscious naturally feels an affinity towards it. So what happens, neuroscience has basically pieced together this system that I'm showing you up here, where we've got the ego or the conscious mind. That's what you're sitting here now, those of you who are listening to me. The other ones are paying, whatever you're paying attention to, that's your ego. And it's riding on what we call the id. And the id is this horse that it's going to make our morally sufficient judgments are going to come out of that id. We think we're going to give it codes of ethics. Hey, look, do this. The id's going to do what it wants to do. So, and again, at the end of his life, Freud proposed the superego, which he said he recognized the conscience. He called it the superego, and he said it does come from the id, and it is the overriding, morally sufficient decision that we make. That decision becomes a conscious decision called the superego from Freud, but basically its source also is the id, where the ego is riding as well. So, human decisions originate on the horse we ride called the subconscious, and then the conscious is made aware of the decision by the subconscious. Now Google subconscious decision making and see the data that supports this. It's phenomenal. It's enormous. My best example of an experiment was done at Stanford. Right? They took students like yourselves, like I took this class, and they give you a button, 2 buttons, a red button and a green button, and there was a light, and the light would be red. So they said, well, if this light changes to green, press the green button, right? And don't, So what would happen is neuroscience measured the time difference between the subconscious making the decision, because they were wired up, and the conscious mind receiving that data. In between that time, they would change the light. So the light would go to green, right? The subconscious would make the decision, but it hadn't informed the conscious mind yet, right? Well, in between, they would switch it back. They would switch it back to red, and the people went berserk. They were apologizing. Oh, I'm sorry. I don't. All of them. I don't know why I did that. They were all hitting the button, but their conscious mind had no idea why they had hit the button because they had switched it back to the red. So if you Google this and look at some of the other experiments, there's some that are really hilarious. They got one experiment also that I really like. Your mind compresses time. So if I were to give you that experiment between hitting the light without fooling you, your mind would eventually coalesce, like Jeopardy. At the end of the question, the guy hits the thing, right? Well, your mind will compress that to be simultaneous. So if you show someone that light over and over and over again, right? But then make it truly instantaneous. In other words, you had a time delay before. Now you make it instantaneous. People hit the light. They're sure that they made the decision before the light appeared. In other words, if you ask them, when did you make the decision? Well, I knew it was going to change. In other words, it wasn't a reaction thing. They had pre-knowledge that the light was going to change color. It's hilarious. So it just basically, I don't know how you could not agree that your subconscious is making these decisions. So all your decision making comes from this horse, right? It's nice. It's a good thing to realize that. Makes a lot of things you do forgivable, right? It doesn't mean that the horse isn't trainable like a horse. It just means that we have to be aware of it before we start condemning people. When you watch the talking heads on TV, what are you looking at? You're looking at their subconscious feelings. We know now, other neuroscientists have published books on it, that there's two levels of decision making. There's the initial decision making from our evolution. It comes from being fear or flight. Was it fight or fly, right? That fear decision is the first one that comes out for our survival. Then there's a conscious decision. There's the ironic anxiety decision that comes from your conscious mind, comes later. When you watch these talking heads on TV, you're just looking at their subconscious throwing these things out without any thought behind them at all. So you can see how this stuff is work. So the new research makes it clear that we are not alone. That's how I talk to myself. So if I do something stupid in an airplane, I say, what the hell did you do that for? And I'm the only guy in the airplane. So who am I talking to, right? Talking to my subconscious. What'd you do that for? We have company, an invisible partner, who has strong reactions about the world that doesn't always agree with ours, whose instincts these studies show are at least as likely to be helpful and attentive as they are to be disruptive and dangerous. That's from a New York Times article. I get it there. You can look it up. It's one of the sources that you would get if you're looking at your subconscious. So, cool stuff. I mean, very, very interesting. So if I was going to review all this, then what we've talked about, the rational influences, the good, secular humanism, these is all the rational stuff, determines the right actions based on pleasure and happiness, a good life and a meaningful life for most people, right? Too bad we have slavery, but that's only like 10% of the population. The rest of us we're having a great time. So it kind of explains why slavery was such an inherent part of human experience for so long, until modern times. Slavery was because it fits this rational, well, this is how things should work, right? And then we have the right, which is the external right. Now we have laws. Now, since Moses' time, the lawgiver, right? We were following these laws as opposed to some dictator or some king. And the external codes and rules determine good actions. So the good comes from the right, duty, our intention, promise, and the right laws. So both systems are necessary within themselves. They're both rational. They're necessary, but they're insufficient to make a decision because they do not consider the subconscious. They do not consider the subconscious. So irrationally, I use irrational, not irrational. Your irrational decision should consider the good and the right. You should consider it, but realize that your gut decision, right? If I look back on what I told that pilot in Pave Deuce, who was not describing, he was trying to save jobs and save the program. I look back, I still wouldn't change what I did, but I can understand his point of view, right? And when I talked to the accident board for my helicopter accident that I was part of, I would not change what I would say, but I can't defend it logically anymore. That's what I feel from my gut. So the irrational is beyond, not against reason, resides in the subconscious. And the superego is informed of that by your subconscious. Your superego, what we call our external conscious, is informed of that and expresses that. And of course, we have the ego riding the horse, which is a great metaphor. It's a good way to remember it, especially if I'm giving you a quiz on it, right? Is a good way. And it's decisive. When you make that decision, you're done. We're going to give some examples next week when we talk about the Manhattan Project. You're going to see some great examples of one way, great examples for the other way, and someone's going to come up and just nail both of them. Be based on a decision based on a personal conscience. So that final decision is often embedded from intense experience, and uncertainty has got to be part of it. If you're not uncertain about your decision, then you're probably beyond listening to me. Probably, you're on the road to fanaticism. So it's always good to have what the religious people would call this, the ones I know would call it faith. Right? Faith always has a tiny bit of, like yeast in the bread, It's a little bit of skepticism about what you want to burn this guy alive. You really want to do that? Oh, I don't think so. So uncertainty is necessary, and that means you're going to hold on to some anxiety in your decision making. Your decision making always, but the harder it gets, the more anxiety you're going to get, and you have a lot of burden then to carry. The higher up you go, right? And where does that internal source of conscience come from? Well, the psychiatrists and psychoanalysts have told us that, and it looks like neuroscience is backing it up today with a lot of data. If you find some neuroscience data or things when you're Googling that contradict or would go against, please send it to me. I'd be glad to look at it. But looks like young proto-images of antiquity are right on target at describing our cultural differences, our collective subconscious course is a proto-language. It emerges as a universal myth or a saga. Here we have in the United States, we have that saga too, don't we? Because if you take Spinoza and look how his followers taught John Locke, right? Who did John Locke? John Locke interfaced with Immanuel Kant in Germany, not with Bentham, but Immanuel Kant's ideas from England became, who do we know that took John Locke's ideas and put them in a written document? Thomas Jefferson. The Declaration of Independence is basically, John Locke quotes, separation of church and state, individual rights, all people are created equal, right? All those rational things from Jefferson are Jefferson copying John Locke, who got his ideas from Spinoza. Right? You see how it flows today, right? Lincoln made the final change. I'm going to point out Lincoln, because if you remember, I think I mentioned this once, that Jefferson originally was going to put down the idea that we're all created equal, and all this stuff was sacred, and Benjamin Franklin said, no, we're going away from the dogma part. I mean, not that dogma was bad. We're just going away from it. Put down self-evident. So Jefferson changed it, and now it's these truths we hold to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. And on you go with the list. What did Lincoln do? Well, he gave probably the greatest speech ever given in 2 minutes at Gettysburg. And what did he say? We're dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal, right? And I'll be all people, right? All men and women are created equal. Well, he changed it then. Went from sacred to self-evident to a proposition. What was Lincoln saying? He's looking at 30,000 dead here, both sides. He's saying, the American experiment is a proposition that has to be challenged and accepted by every generation, right? It's an experiment. That's what de Tocqueville said. And Lincoln basically took those ideas and said he challenged every generation from himself to do something to make the experiment work. And where else could it work? We got a country of immigrants from all over, every race, every ethnicity, right? Always coming in. So, I mean, it's going to be hard to go to a Middle East country or an ancient country that has embedded beliefs for thousands of years. But here in America, we don't have any of that. 200 years to us is huge. It's ancient history, right? So if it doesn't work here, where are you going to make it work? Where are you going to go and make it work? I don't know. So the challenge is there. I don't think it's changed since Lincoln. In my view, in my experience, in my life, it's always been a challenge, from the civil rights movement of the 60s to the issues today of climate change and all the rest of it. It's just a continual fight, right? And I'm very wary of people who have the solution. We're going to put this government in and it's going to fix us. Really? The founders were afraid of powerful governments because they tended in human history to become despotic. All you got to do is look at Venezuela or some modern analogy to see that that still holds true. So that's where we're at with ethics. Do you kind of get an idea where I'm coming from now with it? You're going to have your own opinion of things, but I want you to look at the good. I want you to look at the right, and then do the pros and the cons. Pull yourself away from the issue as much as you can. Don't be a talking head. Pull yourself away from it, and then give me your conscious decision, and try to make it flow in just a few sentences when I ask you something. That's what I look for in your essay. You kind of see what I'll be looking for in your essay. That's going to be hard because you got 5 different people, right? Maybe 6 even, and they might have different ideas about what you're talking about. Some will be for disarmament, some will be for armament, some will be, so how the group leader has a huge task in trying to make that flow in a reasonable way and readable way for me to grade it. That's what I wanted. I wanted to make sure that you're all pretty sure now in the presentations what I'm looking for, on the essays, and of course on the final exam what I'll be looking for. It sounds ethical, but relax. It's only a problem if you have a conscience. I think I do. Don't worry, I won't tell a soul. You failed the online course for the third time. You can't be an engineer if you have no grasp of business ethics. You leave me no choice. I'm putting you on the management fast track. True. The ones that are true are the funniest, aren't they? So, science. All you science people, all you rational people out there, take a humanities person to lunch. Right? The idea is you got to come together. We got to come together on this as a proposition to make it work. So I've tried to give you an idea of what the midterm exam is going to be like. There will be multiple exams. These are the exams on my desk. They're all made already. So I'll just be handing those out on test day. And there's your quiz for today. You got 10 minutes. You know how to do it. Just turn your quiz in on your way out. Or if you need more time, turn it in at the start of class. The start of class. If you think you can do it now.